Well, those were your top stories for the day, but moving on to an interesting discussion based on the fact that we've seen recent resignation of Massmart Chief Executive Grant Patterson from his position. Koos Becker has also resigned from Naspers, and Brian Damas at Eskom have. All of these has put the spotlight on executive appointments. But joining me now to discuss this as well as executive compensation is Andrew Woodburn. He's the MD of Woodburn Mann, as well as Anne Pratt, MD of Memela Pratt and Associates. Lady and gent, thank you so much for joining us today. Perhaps if we take a look at the movements regarding executives on the top 40. We mentioned Grant Patterson from Massmart, Brian Damas from Eskom, as well as Mark Lamberti. Are you surprised by these? Because these are guys who have practically almost been entrenched in their positions. And
Gugu, no, I don't think so. I think, you need to look at an organisation in a context and time. If you look at Grant's history, he's been with Massmart for 17 years. He was CEO for 7 years. Mark Lamberti was part of the founding group, and he's been with the organisation for many years. And I think you see a very planned succession plan that has been very well managed. The successor to Grant is Guy Howard, who's also been in the group for the last 12 years. He came in as FD. He got put into the COO position almost 2 years ago, and it'll be 2 years when he takes over from Grant. So I think it's a very well managed, and even the replacement to Mark, Kuseni Dlamini's been on the board. So I think everything has been very well managed and planned, and very long tenure.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the succession planning has been done correctly there. Perhaps if we just suppose that with a state-owned entity like Eskom, where there have been a lot of concerns about the lack of proper succession planning there. Andrew, is there something that Eskom could have done right there?
Look, Eskom's been an interesting animal. It has a huge amount of complexity to the role, because not only are they having to provide you and I with electricity to keep the lights on.
And keep the coal covered from the rain.
Correct. But they've had to endure in the power sector effectively a very long cycle industry that's even then had to manage the transition of political control in the country from one agenda to a different agenda. So many balls in the air. They have been at the forefront of transformation themselves. But it's difficult to find people who can manage large companies at that level of scale effectively in our marketplace. The rest of the world wants our talent. So it's always a challenge between who's available to the job, what are we going to pay them, and how successful can they actually be based on the set of challenges ahead of them. So what we do know, taking Grant, for example, and Brian, is that 30 years ago and 40 years ago, those senior executives that sit on the board now will have told you could have a career for life in a company. Then we moved to 2 or 3 different careers in the lifespan of an executive. Now, Grant Patterson will tell you he believes 7 or 8 years of tenure is effective to do what he came to do, and after that he's merely reinventing the wheel. So is it time to go or not? And so we've seen a huge increase in the dynamics of our industry. We've seen the brain drain. We've seen financial crisis. The world out there is a tough place to be successful.
It's interesting that you mentioned Massmart as well as the internal cultivation of leaders within the company. We had Mark Lamberti, Grant Patterson, and now Guy Hayward, if I'm not mistaken. Is it always the best option to look for someone internally?
Well, a good process will have options internally. But what one does want to do at the nominations committee level is make sure that the very best of the internals are compared with the very best of the externals. And if you run a robust and sure-footed process that has a lot of depth to it, then that nominations committee can stand back and say, we believe, based on what the choices were available to us, that we've made the very best decision for our company. And if they do that, then they've executed their duty to the best level they are able to. Of course, there are other complexities, such as external shareholders like Walmart, which may have a view about what they want, or in the state-owned enterprise space, what the minister might want.
Exactly.
So it doesn't always mean that the obvious candidate gets the job, because there are other elements at play to some of these decisions.
Keeping with state-owned entities, and I understand that your company is in the process of finding a permanent candidate for Eskom. Perhaps if you can enlighten us as to how far you are and the kind of qualifications that you're looking for. Perhaps do I fit the job? Okay. I know where to find the light switch. Is that enough?
That would be a tall ask, Gugu. Yeah. I think, with regarding to Eskom and the groups here, as Andrew has alluded to, there is a complexity about it. I think in terms, and he's also mentioned, and I think that's right, there are very few people in the country who could actually take on an organisation of that size. It's 130 billion revenue, it's 46,000 employees. So, the challenge is that one should not define the brief too narrowly, but one should also be very mindful of the key strategic challenges that that really are facing the organisation at a moment in time. So in the context of Eskom, it was really about, we need somebody who is appropriately degreed, ideally an engineer, different views about that, but, ideally an engineer, and somebody who has led the turnaround of an organisation of at least in excess of 1.6 billion revenue and 5,000 people.
That's a hectic CV, Anne.
Yeah, well, it is. I think the other thing is, and of course with state-owned enterprises, the person has to have the ability to do the stakeholder management. We have government as a shareholder. Obviously the views of the minister is important. We have elections coming up on the 7th of May. So does the current minister, will he remain in the portfolio? That adds another complexity. When new ministers come in, sometimes they change their boards. We're sitting in a very kind of uncertain period. However, the process needs to go on, and the process is going on, and we're making good progress.
Well, you're making good progress. Hopefully we'll find a CEO sometime soon. But interestingly enough, is also stats regarding the level of qualifications that CEOs or heads of companies have to have. I've heard rumors about a third of CEOs that are appointed are actually qualified chartered accountants. Is that true? And are we seeing particular trends regarding different industries? Andrew?
Look, it's definitely a trend, because the two sets of skills that are hugely in demand, Anne mentioned an engineer and obviously the chartered accountant qualification. Why are those two sets of skills required is the question that should be asked. Not, we're worried that too many CEOs are CAs, right? And effectively it's attention to detail, it's a deep understanding of how the business works, and its ability to solve problems and lead from the front. And in general, that means a mix, as Anne said, from everything from stakeholder management through to actually understanding the tax issues, the fundamental finances of business and everything else. And so what one finds is those two qualifications are often required for different businesses in order to lead them into the future. Now, it doesn't always mean that that's the case in IT or in other kinds of businesses, for example, like media. But often the CFO is right at the sharp end of key decision making and are often the obvious successor to the CEO, because the CFO plays a key role as the right-hand person to the CEO for many years and then is uniquely positioned to continue the work that's there. But in turnarounds, in difficult marketplaces, in financial crisis, often we find that companies then look for new blood who are going to bring in a different set of skills to manage the challenges. So am I worried that many CEOs are CAs? Not necessarily. I just hope SAICA can keep a great amount of CAs coming into the marketplace at a graduate level, because our country needs that anywhere, whether it's government, whether it's free enterprise, or whether it's NGOs. And so the key for me is, what is the state and the educational facilities doing to really promote top qualified graduates entering the marketplace?
Very quickly, to get to the burning issue, is these CAs that are qualified or engineers who head up large corporations, the pay that they receive. Many shareholders have been very vocal about the level of pay, and is it too much, is it too little? Hence the platinum sector strikes that are going on at the moment. Is it justified for these individuals to earn such copious amounts of remuneration? And are we as shareholders in a position to question that?
Giga, very a hot potato. I think it depends on whether you take a South African view or just a view, a global view. I think in South Africa we have the complexity that pay has, an executive pay has the kind of added complexity of being linked to the ills of our past, the imbalances of our past. And that creates a greater complexity. If you have a look in just a free market economy where capitalism thrives, it really is a case of supply and demand. And, supply and demand, and the balance between that will determine price. And, so I think it also, I think the real issue in South Africa really comes back to different kinds of issues. It's about unemployment. And in terms of unemployment, it's about education. Are we really skilling people in our economy? And it comes back to government policy. Do we have the right kind of macro and microeconomic policies to actually stimulate the growth in the economy, educate our own people, so our own people are climbing through the ranks? And, I think it's a lot more complex. If you go offshore and look at, free market economies overseas, supply and demand prevails. And I think in other countries like the Nordic countries, where there is a heightened sense of social responsibility, the CEO will still earn the price that the market demands. Government will then tax them at a higher rate to redistribute that. And that is a government policy issue.
So quite clearly it is a multi-pronged approach that we need to undertake here. To my two guests, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic speaking to you. That was Andrew Woodburn. He is the MD of Woodburn Mann, as well as Anne Pratt, MD of Mamela Pratt and Associates.